It is the spring of 1922. Along a dusty stretch of railway outside Beijing, two armies are digging in. Neither one wears the uniform of a united nation. Neither one answers to a single government. They are private armies, loyal only to the men who built them, men the world will come to call warlords. Over the next 6 years, China will be ripped apart by a chain reaction of betrayals, secret bribes, foreign intrigue, and battles fought with First World War surplus weapons on Chinese soil. Alliances will form and collapse within months. A revolutionary movement from the south will rise to challenge them all. And when the smoke finally clears in 1928, the men who set this chaos in motion will already be dead, exiled, or discarded, replaced by new forces that are about to drag China into an even larger and bloodier century. This is the story of the wars that decided who would rule China, and the forgotten conflict that set the stage for everything that came after. Welcome back. Today we're heading to East Asia, to a period of Chinese history that rarely gets the attention it deserves, despite shaping the entire 20th century for over 1 billion people. To understand how this war began, we have to rewind a few years. In 1912, China's last imperial dynasty collapsed, and a fragile republic rose in its place. On paper, China now had a president, a parliament, and the trappings of a modern state. In reality, the new republic barely survived its own infancy. Real power drained away from the capital and into the hands of regional military commanders. Men who controlled their own soldiers, their own tax revenue, and their own territory, and who owed the central government little more than lip service. These men were the warlords. Over time, they didn't operate alone. They banded together into shifting coalitions built around shared interests, personal loyalty, or simple convenience. These coalitions became known as cliques. By 1920, 3 cliques dominated the north and center of the country, while a rival nationalist government in the south, led by the revolutionary Sun Yat-sen, tried to claim legitimacy of its own. It was an uneasy balance from the start, and in 1922 that balance was about to break. To understand the war that followed, you first need to understand the man at the center of it, a warlord known to his enemies, and eventually to history, as the Tiger of Manchuria. He began his career far from the halls of power, running with armed bands in the borderlands of northeast China during the chaos of the Russo-Japanese War. It was a rough education, but an effective one. He built a reputation for ruthlessness, and a talent for making useful friends. And by the mid-1910s, he had converted that reputation into real authority, carving out control over the 3 provinces of Manchuria and answering to Beijing only when it suited him. He was not shy about using his position. He modernized his territory's industry, built up arsenals, and funneled the overwhelming majority of his revenue into his army. By the early 1920s, that army numbered somewhere around 100,000 men, better trained, better equipped, and more disciplined than most of the forces fielded by his rivals. Much of that edge came from a quiet but crucial partner, Japan, which saw in this warlord a useful tool for extending its own influence into Manchuria and armed him accordingly. But he had ambitions that went far beyond his home provinces, and that ambition was about to put him on a collision course with a rival clique that considered itself the rightful power in Beijing. Before the fighting starts, it's worth understanding just how many outside hands were stirring this pot. China in the early 1920s was not fighting in isolation. Foreign powers had carved out concessions in its port cities and treaty ports decades earlier, and those same powers were now watching the warlord conflicts with real interest, not out of ideological conviction, but out of cold calculation about who might best serve their strategic and commercial goals. Japan was the most deeply involved. While officially committed to a policy of non-interference, in practice Tokyo funneled weapons, military advisors, and intelligence to its Manchurian ally, hoping to secure long-term economic and territorial footholds in the region. The relationship was never entirely comfortable. Japan wanted a partner who would stay useful and stay put, while its Manchurian ally increasingly wanted a seat at the national table. The Soviet Union, fresh off its own civil war, was also looking for friends in China. Soviet agents made contact with southern revolutionary groups, offering arms and expertise to anyone willing to accept them. A move that unsettled Japan and the Western powers, who worried about the spread of Bolshevik influence into East Asia. Beyond the great powers, China's battlefields attracted a colorful cast of independent operators, European arms dealers who made fortunes selling off surplus weapons left over from the First World War, and foreign mercenaries and advisors who attached themselves to whichever warlord could pay. Chinese armies of this era fought with a strange mix of imported artillery, second-hand rifles, and even the occasional antique, a patchwork reflecting just how many outside interests were quietly betting on the outcome. Beyond the great powers, China's battlefields attracted a colorful cast of independent operators. European arms dealers made small fortunes selling off surplus rifles, artillery, and machine guns left over from the First World War, technically illegal under international agreements, but rarely enforced with any real conviction. Foreign mercenaries and soldiers of fortune drifted from warlord to warlord, offering their services to whoever could pay. One Southern revolutionary leader employed a personal bodyguard built around a Polish-born, British-raised adventurer famous for dual-wielding revolvers. Another faction relied on a one-armed English engineer to run its arsenal and reverse-engineer British mortar designs. A northern warlord, notorious for his brutality and nicknamed for his fondness for canine mascots, hired thousands of white Russian exiles fleeing the aftermath of their own civil war, forming entire units of foreign mercenaries fighting under a Chinese warlord's banner. It made for a strange patchwork kind of warfare. Armies equipped with a mismatched inventory of imported artillery, second-hand European rifles, locally manufactured copies of foreign weapons, and in some of the poorer provincial forces, the occasional antique matchlock that would have looked more at home in a museum than on a battlefield. This was a conflict fought with the discarded machinery of a world war that China itself had barely participated in, now repurposed to tear the country apart from within. By the spring of 1922, all these threads, ambition, rivalry, and foreign backing, were pulled tight. It would only take a spark. That spark came in April 1922. Tensions between the Manchurian warlord and his rival clique to the south had been building for months, fueled by mutual suspicion and increasingly public accusations, one side calling the other a foreign puppet, the other firing back that its rival was nothing more than a bandit playing dress-up as a statesman. The Manchurian warlord believed he held the military advantage and moved to install a prime minister of his own choosing in Beijing. His rivals refused to accept it. War broke out. On paper, the numbers favored the rival clique, reinforced by the remnants of a previously defeated faction. Their combined forces claimed to number in the hundreds of thousands. In reality, many of those units existed only on paper, poorly supplied and half-strength. The Manchurian side, by contrast, fielded a smaller but far more cohesive force, backed by superior artillery and machine guns. The fighting played out largely along China's railway corridors, with both sides shuttling troops and supplies up and down the same lines that connected Beijing to the northeast. For several days, the two armies clashed near the outskirts of the capital in brutal, back-and-forth engagements. In early May, a flanking maneuver by one of the rival clique's most colorful commanders, a general known for his outspoken Christian faith and progressive reforms, broke the Manchurian lines. Panic spread through the ranks, and what had been an orderly retreat turned into a rout. Within barely a week, the war was over. Thousands of soldiers were dead, thousands more wounded, and the victorious clique now controlled Beijing outright. But their rival wasn't finished. He simply withdrew to his stronghold, declared his provinces independent from the central government, and began rebuilding an even stronger army for the rematch everyone suspected was coming. Victory did not bring stability. The clique now dominating Beijing quickly found itself fracturing from the inside. Its political leader secured the presidency through outright bribery, while its senior military commander grew resentful of interference in his own authority. Meanwhile, the general whose battlefield maneuver had won them, the war began drifting away from his own faction, introducing his own reforms in the territory under his control, and quietly wondering whether his alliance still served his interests. By the autumn of 1924, this fragile coalition was about to be tested again. Fighting broke out to the south, and the Manchurian warlord, eager for revenge after his earlier defeat, seized the opportunity to re-enter the war. His rival, expecting exactly this, split his forces into multiple armies to fight on several fronts simultaneously, with one army driving straight toward Manchuria itself through a narrow mountain pass along the Great Wall. For weeks, that offensive stalled against determined defense. The rival commander believed he had found a decisive opening, ordering his ally, the reform-minded Christian general, to strike from the west and catch the Manchurian forces from behind. But that general had other plans. He had been distancing himself from the alliance for months, and when a substantial bribe arrived from the Manchurian side, he made his choice. Instead of attacking, he turned his army around, marched on Beijing, and arrested the very president his own faction had installed. It was a stunning betrayal, and it shattered his former ally's position overnight. Cut off, outmaneuvered, and abandoned by his own subordinate, the rival commander was forced into a humiliating retreat, leaving behind weapons, supplies, and any claim to national leadership. As a political force, his clique was finished. The war had lasted barely a month, but its scale dwarfed the previous conflict. Tens of thousands of casualties, and clear signs that Chinese warfare was evolving into something closer to the industrialized violence Europe had just endured. And, in its aftermath, the general whose betrayal had decided everything found a new patron of his own, Moscow, eager to back anyone who might counterbalance Japan's influence in the north. While the warlords tore at each other in the north, a very different kind of movement was taking shape in the south. Its leader, a longtime revolutionary who had helped topple the old imperial dynasty a decade earlier, had spent years watching his republic dissolve into warlordism and foreign humiliation. He believed only one thing could reverse it: a unified military campaign to sweep the warlords aside entirely, followed by the creation of a genuinely national government. The problem was capability. His movement's army was small, underfunded, and poorly armed. By the mid-1920s, it could field barely enough rifles for its own men, let alone challenge the far larger warlord armies in the north. Appeals to Western powers and Japan for support went nowhere. So, like the general in the north, he turned to the only major power willing to help, the Soviet Union. In exchange for Soviet weapons and advisors, his Nationalist Party entered into an uneasy partnership with China's fledgling Communist Party, two very different visions of China's future, temporarily united by a common enemy and a common patron. A new military academy was founded to train a generation of officers steeped in revolutionary discipline, intended to be less susceptible to the kind of personal betrayal that had defined the warlord wars. When the movement's founder died in 1925, leadership passed to the head of that academy, an ambitious young commander determined to finish what his predecessor had started. Within a year, his forces were ready. In the summer of 1926, the Southern Army began a campaign that would become known as the Northern Expedition, a march north through warlord territory, aimed squarely at unifying the country by force. The Northern Expedition was, by any conventional military logic, a gamble bordering on recklessness. The Northern warlords, including a resurgent Manchurian faction, now stronger than ever after crushing its Soviet-backed rival, commanded far larger and better equipped forces. Beijing itself lay over 1,000 miles from the expedition's starting point. But the Southern commander had a plan: strike one warlord at a time, preventing his enemies from uniting against him. His first target was the weakened clique that had lost so much ground in the previous wars. Facing an already demoralized enemy, the Southern Army advanced quickly, absorbing defections and pushing north along the rail lines. By late summer 1926, they had seized a major central China stronghold, forcing their target's forces into retreat and effectively destroying his faction as a political force. The next campaign proved far bloodier. Turning east against another regional warlord, the Southern Army found itself locked in brutal, seesawing battles for control of a key provincial capital, with the city changing hands multiple times. Losses were staggering on both sides. The Southern Army alone may have lost tens of thousands of men in a matter of weeks, including many of the very officers trained to be its future backbone. Only a local uprising against their opponent, diverting his troops at a critical moment, finally tipped the balance and allowed the expedition to push across the Yangtze River. By early 1927, the campaign had reached Shanghai and Nanjing, major cities with large foreign populations, drawing the attention of the international community, which rushed troops of its own to protect foreign nationals and interests. The Southern commander moved quickly to reassure the world that his revolution had no quarrel with foreigners, even as tensions boiled within his own movement. And those tensions were about to explode. The Communist-Nationalist alliance, always uneasy, had been fraying for months. Communist organizers used the momentum of the expedition to agitate among workers and peasants, establishing a rival power base in one of the newly captured cities. To secure Western and Japanese cooperation, and his own authority, the nationalist commander made a brutal decision. In April 1927, he turned on his former allies, purging Communist Party members from his ranks in a violent crackdown that shattered the United Front for good. The movement was now effectively split in two: a nationalist government in one city, a communist-aligned faction in another. Just as the war against the remaining northern warlords entered its most dangerous phase. Momentum stalled. The nationalist commander, under pressure from all sides, briefly resigned his command altogether, only to return to lead a renewed offensive in the spring of 1928. That final push brought his forces dangerously close to Japanese-controlled territory in the north, triggering a violent clash between Chinese and Japanese troops that further complicated an already chaotic campaign. Japan's intervention wasn't militarily decisive, but it was a clear signal. Outside powers were no longer content to simply watch from the sidelines. By June 1928, the endgame arrived swiftly. The Manchurian warlord, sensing the war was lost, abandoned Beijing without a fight and began the journey home. He never made it. As his train crossed back into Manchuria, a bomb, planted by the same Japanese faction that had once armed and supported him, tore through the tracks, killing him instantly. Japan had decided its old ally was no longer useful, and hoped his drug-addicted, more pliable son would prove easier to control. They were wrong. The younger warlord suspected Japanese involvement in his father's death and, rather than accepting Tokyo's patronage, threw his support behind the nationalist government instead. By the end of 1928, nationalist forces raised their flag over the last major warlord stronghold in Manchuria. After 6 years of shifting alliances, betrayals, and battles that had claimed tens of thousands of lives, China was, for the first time since the fall of the empire, nominally unified under a single government. It would prove to be a fragile, temporary peace. Behind the flags and victory parades, the human cost of 6 years of warlord conflict was staggering. Entire provinces had been stripped bare by competing armies living off the land. Taxes collected years in advance were spent before the crops that would have paid them were even planted, and countless civilians had been caught between marauding soldiers on one side and bandit gangs on the other. Public opinion, once cautiously hopeful that strong military men might restore order, had curdled into open contempt for the warlord system by the campaign's final years, a sentiment the nationalist movement had skillfully, if imperfectly, turned to its advantage. And the same forces that had fought their way through this war were all still very much alive. A resurgent nationalist government now controlled the country in name, but its authority in the countryside remained thin. An underground communist movement, driven out of the cities by the very purge that had helped the nationalists win, was quietly regrouping in rural strongholds under a young organizer named Mao Zedong, developing tactics and a base of support that would prove far more durable than anyone in 1928 could have predicted. And an increasingly assertive Japan, having just demonstrated with a single bomb how easily it could reshape Chinese politics through force, was only beginning to reveal its ambitions in the region. Within a few short years, these three forces, nationalist, communist, and Japanese, would collide again in a conflict far larger and far more devastating than anything the warlord era had produced. This period rarely gets the recognition it deserves, and it's not hard to see why. It's messy. It doesn't have a single clear hero or villain. Alliances shift so often that keeping track of who's fighting whom can feel like a full-time job. But if you want to understand modern China, how the Communist Party rose to power, how Japan's invasion took the shape it did, how the seeds of decades of conflict were planted, this forgotten war is where that story actually begins. If you enjoyed this deep dive, let us know in the comments which era of history you'd like us to cover next. And if you want to support more long-form, deeply researched content like this, consider subscribing and sharing this video. The algorithm doesn't always reward this kind of history, so word of mouth genuinely makes the difference. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.